Everything was silent except for the tick of the clock, a sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second as I stood frozen in the hallway. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the door handle to my bedroom. Jean's laughter, light and carefree, echoed from inside, a sound that once brought warmth but now stung with bitterness. I had come home early from a business trip, eager to surprise her, but the surprise was entirely mine. Pushing the door open, the scene before me was like a grotesque tableau. There was Jean, my wife of 5 years, draped scantily across our bed, her laughter ceasing abruptly as her eyes met mine. Beside her, shockingly, was my father, his presence a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. His hands, once my guide in life, now the instruments of my humiliation, paused from their intimate caress of Jean's skin. "Danny?" Jean's voice was a whisper, her usual confidence washed away in guilt. I couldn't speak. The words died in my throat, strangled by a mix of rage and heartache. My father, at least, had the decency to look ashamed. He stood quickly, clumsily adjusting his clothing, his gaze avoiding mine. "You," was all I managed, my voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. Jean sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. "Danny, I can explain," she began, but the cold fury in my eyes must have silenced her. What explanation could suffice? "It's not what it looks like, son," my father interjected, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of panic. "Not what it looks like?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and alien to my own ears. "You're in bed with my wife, Dad. How could it look any different?" The air thickened with tension as I took a step closer, my mind racing with images of their deceit. Jean always said I was like my father, only weaker. Today, that mockery was laid bare, their betrayal the final proof of her scorn. Jean reached out, her hand trembling. "Danny, please, let me." "No," I cut her off, my decision crystallizing with every shattered piece of my heart. "There's nothing you can say. Both of you, you've made your choice." Turning on my heel, I left the room, the sound of Jean's pleading fading behind me. The house, once filled with memories of laughter and love, now felt like a mausoleum of my former life. As I walked away, the plan began to form in my mind, clear and cold. I would not let this betrayal go unanswered. Jean had destroyed the sanctity of our marriage, and with it, she had unleashed a side of me she had never truly known. I would break her life, meticulously and completely, as she had broken my trust. We would divorce, and I would ensure I never saw her again, erasing every trace of her deceit from my life. My father, too, would learn the cost of his actions. The weaker version of him, as Jean so cruelly put it, was gone. In his place was someone who knew betrayal intimately, and how to repay it in kind. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city as I drove, each turn taking me further from the life I had known. My mind raced with the day's revelations, each thought punctuated by a surge of anger and a plan of retribution. I hadn't gone far when my phone vibrated, a message lighting up the screen. It was from Jean, her words a desperate plea. "Danny, please, we need to talk. I'm sorry. Let's fix this." I scoffed, the bitterness in my laugh echoing in the car. Fix this? There was no fixing betrayal of this magnitude. I typed back swiftly, my fingers firm on the keys. "There's nothing left to fix. See you in court." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, my focus narrowing on the road ahead. An hour later, I was sitting across from my lawyer, Martin, in his office. The walls, lined with books and certificates, felt strangely comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of my emotions. "Danny, I've drafted the initial divorce papers," Martin said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. "Given the circumstances, we have a strong case for a favorable settlement." I nodded, scanning the documents. "I want everything," I said firmly. "The house, the savings. I don't want her to walk away with anything." Martin raised an eyebrow, a pencil tapping against his chin thoughtfully. "It's aggressive, but I think we can argue it. Her infidelity, especially with your father, complicates things in your favor." "Good," I replied, my voice cold. "I also want a restraining order." I don't want her anywhere near me. We can file for that as well. It'll help if she tries to contest the terms. Martin scribbled a note on his pad, then looked up at me with a solemn expression. Are you sure about this, Danny? Once we start this, it's a war. I'm sure, I said without hesitation. The image of Jean with my father flashed through my mind, fueling my resolve. Later that evening, I found myself outside the gym where Jean often went for her evening workouts. As I watched her exit, laughing and joking with a friend, rage bubbled up inside me. I approached her, my steps firm and deliberate. Jean! I called out, my voice cutting through the chatter around us. She turned, her smile faltering as she saw me. Danny, what are you? How could you? I interrupted, stepping closer so only she could hear. With my own father? Did you think about our vows? Or was it all just a game to you? Jean's face paled, her eyes widening in fear. I made a mistake, Danny. I'm so sorry. Please, can we talk about this? No, I replied sharply, my gaze steely. We're beyond talking. You'll get the divorce papers tomorrow. As I turned to leave, her friend stepped forward, her expression indignant. You can't just treat her like this, Danny. I can and I will, I retorted without looking back. She made her choice. Driving home, my thoughts were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. The divorce was just the beginning. I would make sure Jean felt the consequences of her betrayal just as deeply as I felt this cut. She had destroyed the man I was, but she would soon learn the extent of my resolve. The weaker version of my father had vanished, replaced by someone forged in the fires of betrayal and sharpened by the intent of retribution. The chapter closes as I arrive home, the lights of the house dim in the twilight, symbolizing the end of one chapter of my life and the dark beginning of another. The morning after serving the divorce papers was grim. As I sat at the kitchen table, the absence of Jean's usual morning bustle was palpable. The silence was not peaceful, it was a reminder of the void her betrayal had carved in my life. I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste mirroring my mood, when the sound of a car pulling up broke the monotony. It was my father. He stepped out, his face haggard, a stark contrast to the confident man he had always appeared to be. I watched him approach, my heart hammering with a mix of rage and a strange, reluctant pity. He knocked. I opened the door, fixing him with a hard stare. Danny, we need to talk, he began, his voice unsteady. There's nothing to talk about, I replied coldly, blocking the doorway. I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry, son, he said, his eyes searching mine for any sign of softening. Sorry doesn't fix anything, I snapped. How could you do this to me? To us? He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I don't have a good answer for you. It was foolish, selfish. I've lost everything now, my son, my dignity. You should have thought of that before, I cut him off. I didn't want his apologies, they couldn't undo what had been done. The tension between us was palpable, a thick, choking fog that neither of us could find our way through. After a long moment, he nodded slowly, defeat etched into the lines of his face. I'll go, he said quietly. If you ever can forgive me. I won't, I interjected, my voice firm. The door closed with a finality that echoed through the house. That afternoon, the fallout continued as I met with Jean's lawyer for the first negotiation session. The office was sterile, the air thick with legal jargon and the unsaid. Jean was there, looking smaller, paler than I remembered. Danny, please, she started as soon as I sat down, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You never do, until it does, I retorted sharply, keeping my eyes on the papers in front of me. Her lawyer, a stern-looking woman, interjected, let's try to keep this civil. We've reviewed the demands, and they're quite extensive. They match the extent of her betrayal, I said flatly. Jean's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. I thought we could work through anything, she whispered. Not this, I replied without looking at her. The negotiation was tense, with her lawyer trying to mitigate the damage. But I was unyielding. The settlement I proposed stripped her of any gains from our marriage. It was harsh, punitive, and exactly what I felt was deserved. As we wrapped up, Jean reached out, her hand shaking. "Danny, I really am sorry." I pulled my hand back, leaving hers hanging in the air. "Save it. I'll see you at the final hearing." Leaving the office, I felt a hollow victory. Justice, or at least the legal semblance of it, was on my side, but it did little to salve the wounds. The drive home was long and gave me too much time to think. The house was quiet when I arrived, a tomb of memories best forgotten. But as I sat down alone, the plans for further retribution began to form. Breaking her financially was just the start. Jean would understand the full consequence of her actions, even if it was the last thing I did. The courtroom was suffused with an ominous silence as the final hearing began. Today would mark the end of everything: my marriage to Jean, my relationship with my father, and the last act of my revenge. I sat, composed, my hands folded in front of me, my eyes never straying to where Jean sat, a mere 10 feet away, yet worlds apart. The judge entered, and the proceedings began, a sterile recitation of grievances and legalese that seemed almost surreal. As Jean's lawyer presented a final plea for leniency in the settlement, citing Jean's emotional distress and regret, I felt a detached amusement. Did she really believe regret could balance the scales now? Then, it was my turn. I stood, my voice steady, as I addressed the court. "Your Honor, this is not just about infidelity or a broken marriage. This is about betrayal of the most personal kind." My gaze finally landed on Jean, who flinched under the intensity. "It's about a trust so fundamentally broken that it cannot be mended." As the judge nodded, preparing to deliver the judgment, a sudden commotion at the back of the room paused everything. A man, disheveled and breathless, burst through the doors. "Wait," he shouted, and all eyes turned to him. It was Michael, a longtime friend of mine, and his presence was the final piece of my carefully laid plan. "Your Honor," Michael began, "there's something you need to see." He held up his phone, displaying a video. My heart beat a steady rhythm of anticipation as the bailiff took the phone and handed it to the judge. The video played, and the courtroom watched in stunned silence. It showed Jean and my father in a staged embrace, laughing about how easily they had deceived me, how they had planned this charade to gain access to my wealth. It was damning, irrefutable evidence of their calculated treachery. The impact was immediate. The judge's expression hardened as she turned to Jean. "Given this new evidence, I am revising the settlement." She paused, her gaze icy. "Jean, you will receive nothing. And I am granting Mr. Daniel a full restraining order against you and your accomplice, his father." Jean's face crumpled, tears finally genuine as she realized the totality of her loss. My father, who had entered the courtroom unnoticed during the commotion, stood frozen, his betrayal laid bare for all to see. But I wasn't finished yet. As they started to leave the courtroom, broken and defeated, I called out, "Jean, father." They turned, hope flickering in their eyes, perhaps thinking of a last-minute reprieve. I smiled, not a warm smile, but one of finality. "I want you to remember this moment, the moment you lost everything. Let it remind you always of the price of betrayal." As they turned away, the parting shot of their despair was a balm to my vengeful heart. But there was no joy in this victory, only the cold satisfaction of justice served. Later, as I stood outside the courthouse, the sun setting on this chapter of my life, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had avenged the wrongs done to me in the most complete manner possible. My revenge was complete, not through violence, but through the insidious unraveling of their lives with their own deceptions. As I walked away, the chapter, and my past life, closed behind me, a book to be shelved and never reopened. The intrigue of betrayal ended here, but my future, a clean slate, was just beginning.